Hey Savvy people, it's Savvy Nick here, and today we'll be going through and continuing writing our Simple List project. Simple List is a C++ program that keeps track of our to-do items, and we're using Visual Studio Code to do all of our programming. And today we'll add and update some code so that we can read in a user's list that's saved in our database file for a particular user. The plan is to edit existing functions in our database class and create the ability to parse through multiple users and multiple lists. Then we'll store those users and lists in a vector and keep track of our list properly. Let me go ahead and start up Visual Studio Code. I got the code in front of me here. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bigger for us to be able to see real clearly. If you're new and stopping by to watch a programming episode today, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos and episodes. So I'm going to be continuing off of what we had last. Alright, and to start off, I want to go ahead and go to the database CPP file. So I'm going to go there instead and focus on this read function first. On a side note, if you need help setting up Visual Studio Code and its environment on Linux, make sure to go ahead and watch the first video in the series. There will be a link in the description below, and then how to set up a makefile that can compile the code, which is in our second video of this series. I also have a Git repository available on GitHub, so if you need to reference the project as we go through the episodes, it's available on there. So last time we wrote a read and write function and created this database class, but today I'm going to be expanding on this read function in order to read in a file with a certain reading scheme that we're going to create. So we have the database list.sl file, so I'm going to go open that up. Right now we only have 3 items which we saved from the last video. I'm going to erase these, and we're going to actually create a little bit of our own format here so we can go ahead and program our code to go ahead and parse through and read through this formatted file. So the way I'm going to do this is anything with a hashtag in front of it will be considered a user. So we have hashtag, which means it's a user, and then we have SavvyNick, which is the username. Following that, we're going to have SavvyNick's list. So I'm just going to put some items in here. So item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and so on and so forth. Following that, we need something telling the code that SavvyNick's list is completed and finished. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a percentage sign. That'll be our delimiter for this project. And a list of items. So all that this means, I kind of just made this up. So again, hashtag means a username. So the username is SavvyNick. And then SavvyNick has a list of items, and those list of items are item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. So a new line character will mean a new item in the list, but you can't see the new line, but it just is an inner. But it does exist. Our process will be able to see that these two are 2 distinct items in our list, as well as 3 and 4. In order to continue, I might as well add another user so we can test properly. And I'm going to call him Savvy, let's see, Bob. And Bob is going to have a few more items. So I'm going to say Bob has item 5, item 6, item 7, and that should be enough for Bob. And again, I'm going to close Bob's list by using a percentage sign. So now I have 2 users with 2 different lists in our database list.sl file. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now let's work on parsing through this list. So currently, our database CPP file, the read function, is incapable of actually reading in that list. It's just going to go line by line through everything and spit out the line currently that's available in the file. So every time it sees a new line character, it's just going to spit out a line, which isn't really helpful since we have defined a few new items such as the username and the end of a list character. So I'm going to go back here, and let's go ahead and make some edits here for this read database function in order for us to be able to use the new list format. So in this while loop, I'm going to make a little bit of a change. And what I want to do is first detect whether or not I have a hashtag to define that the list has a user. So I'm going to do an if statement in here and make sure to read in the line string. And what I'm interested here is a front function, which is just going to return the very first character in the string. And if that character is equal to a hashtag, then I want to go ahead and do something. Otherwise, if the same kind of deal, so line.front is equal to a percentage sign, then I want to do something else. So we got this if, else if statement, and we're checking for two different types of characters here. Finally, if nothing else, we'll go ahead and execute this line of code. And we'll just say something in here in a moment so we can keep track of things. So back to our first part of the if statement here. I just want to spit out whatever we find in here. This is for debugging purposes. So I'm going to do cout and just say that I found a hashtag. And then I'm just going to spit out the line where the hashtag was found. Again, this isn't really necessary for the program, but it makes for nice debugging purposes so we can tell what's happening while we're reading in our database file. Next, I want to go ahead and erase the very first character that is returned by the line string. So we can do that by using a function. So again, string has multiple functions. One is called erase, and what the erase function needs is just where to begin erasing the string from. So we can also take advantage of another function that tells us where the string begins, which is begin. And that's really all we need to supply to this function. It will automatically assume that we want to erase the very first character since we didn't specify how many we wanted to erase. So that should be good enough for us. And that's because I don't want to keep this hashtag in once I'm reading in usernames. So that's why I'm going to add that line of code. So it erases this hashtag while we save the list into our program. Following that, I want to define a new list here. So let's see. Let's make another vector of type string called user list. So this user list will just keep track of our list for each user as we're processing it in this read function. I'm going to use that new user list vector in order to push back the information that we just found, which is line. So just to walk through this real quick, if we do find a hashtag, we'll say that we found a hashtag and spit out the line where we found it. Then we'll erase the very first character and then add it to user list so we can keep track of that user's current list that's being processed. Following that, I'm going to complete the else statement. So this up here was just to find the username. Next, we'll want to find all the items that the user is supplying. So I'm just going to do cout again for debugging purposes. Found a item. And let me just put a space here so it looks a little better. And then I'm going to go ahead again, spit out line, and put a new line character at the end so it makes for a little better formatting there. Following that, again, I'm going to use the user list that we just created to push back line. So anytime we don't find a hashtag or we don't find a percentage sign, we're just going to assume it's an item in our list for the current user and push that back into the list. Let's go ahead and make a save right now. All right, and to do this next portion, we're going to have to make a little bit of edit to our database.h file to include a 2D vector that will help us keep track of our user as well as the list from the user. So I'm going to open up database.h. All right, and currently we have this vector string called list, but I want to go ahead and change this up so that it's actually a two-dimensional vector of strings. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to add another vector here and just close it off with some angle brackets, and that will generate this vector of vector strings. I'm also going to rename my list here. I'm just going to call it main list, and since I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and change it here as well, main list, maybe for the future when we use that. And I'm going to hit save, And following that, I also want to do a return type. So our read function should return something. So currently we're returning nothing. It's a void. So all that means is the function won't return any kind of value. Whereas now I do want to return something, and it's going to be a vector of vector strings. So in order to get your head around a vector of vector strings, just think of it as each individual user having their own list. So like Savvy Nick has his own list. That will be the first main vector. And then the second portion will be the list that Savvy Nick has. So I think you'll understand this a little bit more once we get into creating the code to store all of our items into the 2D vector. So we'll go ahead and move on and go back to database CPP. And down here, we can now work on our line front equaling the percent sign. So let's go ahead and add another line of code. This one again, for debugging purposes, let's just say that we found a percentage, and then we'll just spit out what we found and a new line character. So if we do get a percentage, we'll print out the percentage and put this in front of it, found a percentage, just so we can keep track of things again. And what we'll want to do here is just go ahead and close off our list. So as we're going through things, if we get to a percentage sign, we know that our list has ended. And finally, since we're keeping track of a user list locally in read, we'll want to go ahead and pass this user list into the main list. So how can we do that? Well, since we have a two-dimensional vector, we can do it by passing our vector into the two-dimensional vector. So we do it much like we did down here. We use the pushback function, and now instead of pushing back just a string, we can push back an entire vector that we can keep track of. So that vector is the user list. And there we go, simple as that. Following that, let's just make sure to go ahead and clear out the contents of the user list. We can do that by using the clear function inside of the user list vector. And this will just clear everything in the vector. That way we can reuse it multiple times because we may or may not have multiple users. And up here we're getting an incompatibility issue. It's because our database read function does not match the prototype in database H. So let's just copy this here. So you can see it's defined as a return type of vector strings. So we need to also copy this and paste it in front of our function so that the two match. So after we do this and save, you can see that read becomes compatible again. And since we are returning something, we need to make sure that at the end of our function, we do return the type that we specified we will return. And that is the main list, which is a 2D vector of strings. All right, and everything looks like it's currently happy, so great. If you went ahead and made it this far, please hit the like button. It really does help me out. And I think we're at a point where we can go ahead and test this program to see if we're actually parsing through things properly. So let's go ahead and go to our main CPP file and make sure that we call the read function. So what I want to do is I'm going to call the read function before anything here. That way we can tell whether or not our data is coming in properly right from the start. So I'm just moving basically this data.read up to the top here. So if we supply an argument, which is a username, we'll read in our data, which I think it actually makes more sense to do it after the simplest.name because we want the name of the user before we go ahead and read in a file. It'll help us down the road, and I'll go ahead and launch a new terminal. And let's go ahead and type in make so we can build our file. It looks like things compiled properly, so that's great. Now let's just go ahead and run the program. So we got simplest, and I'm going to type in our user Savvy Nick. As we would expect, we got multiple hashtags and percentage signs as well as items. So let's look back at here in our database CPP function so we can see what happened. So it did find a hashtag Savvy Nick, which is in our list, right? So it pulled that in, then item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and it saw the percentage sign. Then it got the next user, Savvy Bob, item 5, item 6, item 7, and the percentage sign. So it looks like everything populated in properly, and the only way it would have done that is to go through these three clauses here, the if, else if, and the else clause. So it looks like our program is executing properly, which is great. And we get our menu to either add to a list, print the list, etc., which we currently can't use because we're really not doing anything with this list of items. So I'm just going to go ahead and quit out of the program and then continue writing the code here. Next, I want to make a little bit of a change in the database CPP file again, but this time to the write function. I'm going to call this main list again, and this is also going to expect a vector that's a 2D vector. So now instead of just passing in a vector of strings, we're passing in a vector of vector strings. So let me also update the prototype, which is in database.h, this over, and change this around. So now we have a matching prototype and a matching function definition. So following that, since main list doesn't exist, we'll see this little mistake here, and as well as here. So we'll just change those around to match, and everything should be okay at the moment. Now it's complaining here because we do have a problem. Since it's a 2D array, we're not properly addressing the string inside the vector. So what we'll do is we'll have to make a little bit of a change here in our for loop, because we'll have to keep track of the user as well as the items for the user in our vector, since it's a two-dimensional vector. So let's just go ahead and use what we currently have here and make some changes. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and just erase all of this, and we'll start from scratch here. First, let's define an integer user index to keep track of our user, and we'll set that equal to 0. Following that, we want to make sure that the user index doesn't exceed the size of our main list vector object. So main list, and then we can put in the user index and the current size of whatever user vector that we're currently on. Finally, we'll want to increment the user index every time through the loop. So all this is doing here, this first main loop, I'll delete this statement here so we can follow this a little better, is the user index will start at 0. And as long as the user index is less than the size of the current user's vector list, then we'll go ahead and go through the user index. Next, we'll do a second for loop. So let's just do for int list index, so we can iterate through each individual user's list. We'll do list index less than int, very similar to what we had before, but we're addressing the second vector into two-dimensional vector. So user index and list index. And we want the size of that so we don't exceed it. And we'll just increment list index every time we spit out a list item. So again, the first for loop is to just go through the users, and the second is to go through the list of items for each user. That's why we have the two for loops. And let me just close the braces there. Finally, let's just go ahead and write to our database object the main list user index list index. So that just means the current item that we're on, and put a new line character at the end just so we can read it a little easier. So again, we're printing each string that we have to our database so we can write later. We'll work on this actually in a different video. I'm just getting it set up for now. I might actually have an issue here now that I'm thinking about it, but we'll move on. It's not important. Everything will compile since we don't currently have any errors, but we'll look into this in a different video. Back to read. What I'm going to really focus on is being able to read things in. So we're getting close, but we have to make a little bit of a change in our list.cpp file. What I want to do is actually add a new function. So I'm going to go ahead and copy one from above and just press enter a couple times and add in a new function. I'm going to call this one find underscore user list. What this function will do, and I'm going to go ahead and delete everything inside of it right now, is scroll through the vectors and find a user and then just tell us that that user has been found if they do exist in the main list two-dimensional array. So if it exists inside this main list, which is being returned. First, let's go ahead and make our prototype inside the list class. So we'll have to open up list.h, and let's go ahead and add it right here underneath without the colons or list here because it knows it belongs to this class list, so we don't need to specify that again. Hit save and then go back to list CPP. This should clear up, and it does. Next we'll say bool for boolean user find equals false. This is just to keep track of whether we found a user or not. So just to keep things pretty, I'm just going to go ahead and copy these two statements and put them down here and then change this to something like welcome. And then spit out a name. And that should be enough. That way we just know who is the current user and we're welcoming them to the program and seeing if we can't find them in the list. So I'll hit save. Where does this name come from? Well, if you look at database.h, we have a string name which comes from main CPP. It says the first argument that we supply in a terminal is going to go into simplest name. So that's how we have that. Back to list CPP. We'll go down and create a couple more statements. Let's go ahead. We'll need another for loop here. We'll do int user index equal to 0 if the user index is less than a cast of an integer. Main list dot size. Then we'll increment the user index and keep the for loop going. We're just starting the index at 0 and then making sure that the index isn't greater than the main list complete size of the vector. As long as it's not, we'll go through this for loop and increment the user index, so all the statements inside of here will be executed every time the user index increments until it reaches the size of the vector that we have supplied. So main list is currently not supplied in the list.cpp, so we'll have to go ahead and make an edit here in the list.h. So let's go ahead and keep this vector string called list and make a new one. So this is going to be another two-dimensional vector, so we'll have the vector of vector string, and we'll call this the main list. So this is really just think of it for a single user and think of this as all the users and all the lists. And I'm just missing another angle bracket here, and then that should be good. Save that and go back to list CPP, and now this is resolved here. As we're going through the list, let's go ahead and make sure we print out our users here. So main list, user index, so underscore index. And then we want the very first element every time because the very first element is guaranteed based off of our database to be the user with the way we have it set up. And we'll go ahead and put a new line character so we can just see things a little bit easier. Following that, we want an if statement. If our main list contains a user equal to the username supplied, then we want to do something, because that's what this function is meant for, find user list. So we'll search for the user's index in the very first position of our second vector. And if that equals equal to a name, which was supplied by the terminal, then we know we have a match. And we can say cout user has been found. And let's go ahead and spit out that main list username. So the current user index at the very first element in the second vector. We'll just do a new line character for formatting purposes. And then the really nice part is we can just say our current list is then equal to our main list user index. Let's go ahead and just say that the user was then also found, so this is true now, and break out of this for loop. And I misspelled this up here. It's supposed to be user found, not user find. We might also want to return this value type later out of the function, but for now I'm just going to keep it the way it is. And I'm missing a semicolon right here, and then I'm going to go ahead and save that. So let's go through this function real quick. What we're doing is we are incrementing over our entire main list, which is a two-dimensional vector. The first portion is to keep track of a list with multiple items inside of it. And then the second one is to keep track of each individual item. So we'll increment over the very first vector, and that technically is the user. So every time we find a new user, we'll go ahead and spit it out here. And then if we found that the current name supplied by the command is equal to whatever we're currently on, then we spit out, hey, we found that user, their name is this, and then we save the vector that contains our list into list. We also say that the user has been found, so we set that to true, and then we break out of this, for loop. So let's go ahead and save this. And at this point, I think we can go ahead and run the program once more and see if we get the results that we expect. The one thing we'll have to do is call the find user list function in main. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can do simple list dot find user list. We don't have to supply anything because we supplied it up top here, the name anyway. So what we'll do here is we'll take the name that's given to us from the terminal. We'll read data in based off that name. Then we'll go ahead and search through our vector. Then we'll search through our two-dimensional vector to try finding the username. And if we do find the username, we'll go ahead and save that user's list into another copy of the list, which is located in list.h. So basically, this is a two-dimensional vector. This is a one-dimensional vector. This one has our usernames and our lists for each username. And this one only contains a list. So we take and find if we have a username, move their list into this one-dimensional array called list, because that's the current person using the program. So hopefully you understand that. It is a little complicated, but let's go ahead and run the program and see what result we get. So I'm going to open up another terminal here. And then I'm going to do a make in order to build a project. We get a little bit of a warning here. We didn't really use the user found variable, but that's fine. We'll use it at a different time. Let's go ahead. It's just a warning, not an error. So continue on. And I'm just going to supply simple list with Savvy Nick as the user. And let's scroll up a little bit just to make sure that we get some of the debug statements that we would expect. So we found a hashtag, Savvy Nick, found an item, all that good stuff. Great. It says here, welcome Savvy Nick. So we know that our function was called find user list. So let's go back into that. So we at least made it to here. But we do have a problem here because we did not find a user. So it says user has been found if we did find a user, but it doesn't look like we did find a user. So there is something wrong. So give me a few moments to go ahead and look through the code. Let me try one more thing and clear out the screen here. So I'm going to go first make clean, and then I'm going to remake the project. And after that, I'm going to run Savvy Nick again just to make sure that I did compile the header files, and I did. So still not getting it. And I do know why, because I forgot something in main. So main CPP, we say that we're going to get simplelist.name, and we get an argument of the name, and then we read in a file. But let's go to read in database CPP. Well, database read is going to return a two-dimensional vector of strings, so we don't actually do anything with this two-dimensional vector. So we get the vector here, we fill it all up, we return it, but then we don't use it in main. So that's my problem because I didn't use it here. And I do want to use it, and I want to pass it into simplelist.mainList. So it's as simple as doing this statement here. So now I'm saying the simple list main list, which is of the type class list, will now be equal to whatever is read in from the database. So right here, this main list becomes whatever's read in by the database. That should fix things. Then we'll have a record of the main list, and then we can find the user inside the list. So let's go ahead and try that again. I'll go ahead and just make clean and make once more. Run the program. And that was definitely one of my issues, but not my only issue because I'm still not seeing it. And my problem was that I didn't make a save up here. So let me go ahead and save main CPP, run this over again after I make clean and build the program again. I'll run simple list with Savvy Nick, and then this time we have actually found a user, Savvy Nick. The user has been found, Savvy Nick, so that's great. Looks like everything ran properly there. Now the next thing I want to do is we do currently have the ability still to print the menu, so let's go ahead and print the list and see what we get. Look at that, item 1, 2, 3, 4. So we didn't make any edits to the print list function, but since we used the two-dimensional vector to go ahead and just pull out one list from a certain user that was found, we just passed that into our list h vector string list, and then we went ahead and used the same function to go ahead and display that list. So it found all these items in the list. Now, of course, we probably don't want Savvy Nick being displayed as the user, which we can make an edit to the print list in order to go ahead and delete the very first record here. That way it's not showing that one. Otherwise, things look great. So let's go ahead and make a change to the list and see if we get a proper update when we print the list. So if I hit M here and I quit out of the program with 4, then I'm going to go ahead and make a simple change here and just add another item, item 5. So if I save that item and then I go ahead and just simply rerun the program, it says, welcome Savvy Nick, user has been found, Savvy Nick. And let's print our list out and look at that. Item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and item 5 now, which is what we have in our list. We also have a second user called Savvy Bob, so let's go ahead and test him as well. So I'm also going to quit out of the program once more and then change my user to Savvy Bob. What happens if we do that? Look at that. Welcome Savvy Bob. So we did first iterate through and find Savvy Nick as a user, but we skipped that, went to Savvy Bob, and then we found Savvy Bob. And let's see what's in Savvy Bob's list. We have item 5, 6, and 7. Well, this is really starting to get exciting now because we are able to read and write out of a database and keep track of those items in our local program. And I think this is a great place to go ahead and stop for this tutorial. I'm just going to exit out of the program. Next time we'll go ahead and finish up writing to the database as we're getting pretty close to wrapping up this project. Once we're able to write to the database as well as read from it, then we pretty much have a fully functional simple list program, which will keep track of a list of items that a person has to do. Well, I hope you enjoyed this programming tutorial of Simple List, and I hope you continue watching the series. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please post them below in the comments section. Also, make sure to subscribe for future videos and make sure to like the video. Thanks for watching.